Good morning, America, and welcome to NBC News Climate and Crisis segment, where we share top stories about climate change and the global environment. This is Kimberly Kozlowski, and today I am here with a couple of very special guests, Kiana Madaw, a well-known climate scientist, and Elizabeth Harper, co-author of a recently published paper about how ocean acidification may alter predator-prey relationships and weaken interactions between gastropods and crabs. Unfortunately, we cannot have them here in the studio today due to COVID-19 restrictions, but we are thrilled to have them share their stories from afar. Elizabeth, do you want to tell us about the study you and your team did?
Hi, Kimberly. Thanks so much for having me. So my team and I were interested in understanding how ocean acidification might be affecting certain species interactions and interfering with established relationships between predator and prey. Since Kiana is a climate scientist, maybe she can tell us a little more about ocean acidification?
Hi guys, so just to provide some background, ocean acidification is mainly caused by carbon dioxide gas in the atmosphere dissolving into the ocean, which leads to a lowering of the water's pH, making the ocean more acidic. And as climate change worsens, we are seeing this happen more and more, and we're concerned. Elizabeth's study provides a really good example of some of these effects.
Thank you. I'm back in Cambridge now, but we did our research in the USA across different parts of California and Massachusetts. The goal of our study was to measure the impact that elevated temperature and CO2 could have on predator-prey relationships between native and invasive species. We did this by testing responses of 3 snail species with different shell compositions under future ocean conditions. After collecting the crabs and snails from nature, we took them back to our lab where we had our experimental setup all ready to go.
Why did you use snail with varying shell composition? How is that important?
Great question, Kimberly. So their shells function primarily as a defense against predation, and changes in structure due to ocean acidification could alter species' vulnerabilities to predation. For instance, some snails might produce thinner and weaker shells with elevated CO2 levels, depending on the mineralogy of the shell. One snail we studied has a shell composed mostly of aragonite, while the other 2 snails have shells composed mostly of calcite. We'll talk about how this affected our results.
Wow, now I think we would all love to hear about how you conducted your experiment.
So in order to see how the relationship between the crab and snail may be affected by climate change, we measured the performance of the snails. The variables we used to measure performance were feeding by the crabs, survival, and growth, and we measured these variables under current ocean conditions and under future warming and future ocean acidification conditions. And then we measured the snail's performance both with and without the presence of green crabs.
How did you measure future ocean acidification conditions?
We added CO2 to seawater in order to lower the pH and acidify it. The higher temperature and more acidified ocean conditions we used, we actually got from predicted conditions for the North Pacific in 2100.
That's so interesting. I would love to know what the major results from your study were and what they tell us about our future as climate change worsens.
Absolutely. So to start off, temperature had almost no effect on shell growth in any species, and crab presence had substantially lower impacts on growth under high CO2 conditions. But overall, the 3 species in this study varied the most in their growth responses to ocean acidification. The thin aragonite shell of Euro-Salpinx cinerea was heavily eroded under ocean acidification conditions, whereas the thicker calcite shells of the other 2 species were far more resilient to ocean acidification. Because thinner shells lead to weaker defenses against predators, our experiments confirm that shell conditions appear to have strong predictive value of species vulnerabilities to ocean acidification. This led us to conclude that species with shells that are more vulnerable to ocean acidification will become increasingly threatened by predation by crushing predators, particularly if the predators are resilient to ocean acidification. The differences in shell composition between the species in this study would clearly lead to differential survival in the presence of a crushing predator like the green crab.
Kiana, do you have any final words on this study and our future as the climate changes?
I just think it's important for everyone to understand that climate change is likely to have an escalating influence on the balance of predator-prey arms races, and there will likely be consequences for the structure and function of the entire marine ecosystem.
Yes, and I think there's a lot more research to be done on these interactions, obviously beyond just snails and crabs, but I hope I could provide some useful insight based on these species. And thank you so much for letting me share me and my team's work.
Thank you so much, both Elizabeth and Kiana, for joining me today. That concludes today's segment of Climate and Crisis. Tune in next week for some more stories.